Tell me, which one of these two games would you consider to be a JRPG? One of them, Elden Ring, is made by a Japanese brand. Bandai Namco and From Software is helmed by a Japanese person, Hidetaka Miyazaki, and carries all the hallmarks of an RPG or role-playing game. And the other is Sea of Stars, which is made by Sabotage Studio, a indie brand that was based in Quebec and carries all of the hallmarks you'd expect from a more traditional JRPG. So, if you were going off your gut instinct, which of those two games did you say was a JRPG? Because, in my opinion, it's the one that's not Japanese. One of the things that prompted me to make this video is the fact that I actually made two videos fairly recently. 5 JRPGs not to recommend to newcomers, and 5 JRPGs I would recommend to newcomers. And I noticed something very interesting when making those videos. When I mentioned Honkai Star Rail as a game I would not recommend to a newcomer to the JRPG genre, my comments were filled with, but it's not Japanese, it doesn't count. And yet when I looked at the JRPGs I would recommend, no one said a word about Sea of Stars. And that made me wonder, what is a genre and what is it for? Why do we have to have labels when it comes to genres in our video games or our movies or anything really? Well, the idea of a genre is the idea that if you're recommending a game to somebody in this particular example, you tend to want to gear them towards things they already like. So, for example, if I were to recommend somebody Final Fantasy X, I'm fairly sure that by recommending them something like Dragon Quest XI, they're quite likely to want to play a game like that, given that it has a lot of the same qualities that made them like Final Fantasy X in the first place. It's not necessarily about who made the game or where the game came from, it's about evoking an image that fits the idea of what a game could be for the person that particularly wants to play it. So I couldn't help by looking at all those comments in that video where like, oh, Honkai Star Rail's not a Japanese RPG, it's made in China. My first response is, shut up. This of course does absolutely nothing to assuage my idea that the gacha fans will defend their gachas till the ends of the earth under any pretense necessary. One game I should have put in that list of JRPGs I would recommend to a newcomer and didn't for whatever reason is actually one of the most beloved JRPG style games of our time, and it was made by someone in the US. That game is Undertale. Now you can argue that Undertale is not a Japanese role-playing game, and you'd be right, it's not. But if I were to classify it as a traditional JRPG, given that it is directly inspired by the likes of Earthbound and the Mother series, which are Japanese made, you wouldn't fault me for that, right? Undertale looks like a JRPG from the classic era, it plays like a JRPG from the classic era by having extensive interaction with various characters, having turn-based combat. Admittedly, there are factors thrown into combat when it comes to Undertale that remove it from that, but then that could be said of any JRPG of its time. There's just a lot of qualities about Undertale that make it stand out as a JRPG, even though it isn't Japanese. So let's take a different game and see if it would still be considered a JRPG. Final Fantasy XVI. If I tell you I'm looking to play a traditional JRPG, or any kind of JRPG for that matter, is this game the first image that comes to your mind? You have to think about it. When Final Fantasy XVI came out, there was a huge debate as to whether this game was a Final Fantasy even, and I don't think that that's disputable. Final Fantasy XVI has the name Final Fantasy in it, so it clearly is one, but the fact that it's so far removed from its origin point does beg the question as to whether it has not only kind of bent the genre in which its franchise belongs, but bent the style of game it is altogether to make it so that it is no longer what you would consider a Japanese role-playing game. I guess my point with this particular video is that JRPG is no longer a literal term to be used as a genre kind of fixation for a game that somebody's wanting to play. I believe that the term JRPG has become more of an idea, and the idea of a JRPG is those turn-based gameplay, the story-driven kind of narrative and these evocative image of I press buttons and cool stuff happens, which is something that we've loved for generations. And there are actually two very conflicting opinions that come from real titans in this space, which are really interesting to explore. First of all, you have Naoki Yoshida, also known as Joesephyr, developer of Final Fantasy XIV and XVI, who considered the genre term discriminatory about just the way that Japanese developers make games, and thought that it was used to make fun of Japanese developers for making certain titles, like Dragon Quest or Final Fantasy. And he believes that the term should be expanded into just RPG, because there's no difference really between that of a Japanese creation and that of a Western creation. Conversely, you then have Hideki Kamiya here, who is also a titan in the space, having made games like the original Resident Evil, Okami, Beautiful Joe, Bayonetta, none of which you would classify as traditional JRPGs, interestingly. But he actually thinks that the term JRPG should be used as a point of pride, in that there is a uniqueness to Japanese ways of developing RPGs that Westerners don't necessarily have. And according to this article here by IGN, Platinum Games producer Yuji Nakao responded by saying that he had the complete opposite viewpoint of Naoki Yoshida, and said that JRPGs are unique as a subgenre and it doesn't have any negative connotations behind it. I personally agree with, well, both sides actually. I don't think that there should be any negative connotations about Japanese role-playing games, but I do feel that the term JRPG conjures a particular image. As I said, I gave the example of Sea of Stars earlier. If I were to classify that as a JRPG, you would not hold that against me, because it plays like all of the games that inspired it, like Chrono Trigger and Golden Sun and Final Fantasy, all of which are games you would classify as JRPG. I personally believe that the term JRPG, or genres in general, are used to conjure an image of what kind of games a person would recommend to somebody who say, I like JRPGs. Because if somebody says that to you, the first thing you think isn't going to be, oh, I'm going to recommend them Final Fantasy XVI. Another really interesting example of a game you would classify as a JRPG but is as far from a Japanese game as you can possibly get would be something like South Park: The Stick of Truth, which has all of the qualities you would take from a traditional JRPG in the way that exploration is done, the way combat is done, the way the story is presented. Everything screams JRPG. But if I say to you, if this is a JRPG, you'd be like, absolutely not. That doesn't make any sense. South Park is a very American branded thing. But I don't believe you'd be wrong for calling it that. I think that while it's a bit weird because it contains the word Japanese in it, you could still recommend Stick of Truth to somebody who likes the likes of Final Fantasy Classic, Chrono Trigger, Trails, all sorts of other JRPGs. It may not be necessarily anime coded, apart from the times where it mocks anime culture, but it plays like all those other games, so I think it's okay to recommend that to somebody who likes the genre. There's actually a lot of really good examples of Western-made JRPGs out there that maybe I'll make an entire video on, like my favourite ones that I've played, but to spring to mind, you've got stuff like Crosscode, you have Ruin King, a League of Legends story, you have Child of Light, you have Cosmic Star Heroine, you have all of the games that I've mentioned already, like Sea of Stars and Stick of Truth, and all of that stuff. Indivisible is another one that kind of blends fighting game mechanics into it. You could even argue that Stardew Valley is a JRPG, because Harvest Moon was one, and was made by Natsume, which is a Japanese company and is very much a role-playing game, and Stardew Valley is not Japanese-made, but you would call that inspired by JRPGs at the very least. When you think of a Western RPG, what do you think of first? Something like Fallout or Skyrim? It's definitely not the same kind of thing that you would think about when you thought about a Japanese RPG. As a matter of fact, the sort of things that you'd see from FromSoft are more close to what you'd see from a Western RPG, but they're Japanese made. My point of this whole video is that that line is so blurred now that maybe the term Japanese RPG isn't negative or positive, but potentially a little bit outdated. So I kind of want to test this theory with you at home as well. So we're going to play a little bit of a game here. I'm going to name 10 games off the top of my head, and I want a quick fire answer. The first thing that comes to your mind in the comments below for each of these games. Is it or is it not a JRPG to you? So we'll start with one that I've already mentioned in this video, Sea of Stars. Would you consider this an RPG or a JRPG or not? What about Stranger of Paradise Final Fantasy Origin? What about Undertale? Bloodborne? Crosscode? Nier Automata? South Park Stick of Truth? Pokemon Scarlet Violet? Honkai Star Rail? And I'll throw a curveball in as the last one. Final Fantasy XIV. Let me know in the comments below which of those you would consider to be JRPGs. All of them? None of them? You tell me. And continuing that same train of thought, sound off in the comments below and let me know what you consider to be the hallmarks of a JRPG. Not even necessarily a traditional JRPG, but a JRPG. When someone says that word, what's the first thing that you think of? Because like I said earlier, I was very inspired to make this video by the idea that people got mad at me for saying that Honkai Star Rail was a JRPG, but didn't say a word when I said that Sea of Stars was one. So I really want to know from you, what are the qualities that you look for when you hear that word? So yeah, that's everything I have to say on this particular subject. If you've enjoyed this conversation or want to take part further, you're more than welcome come and find me on Twitch or Discord or Twitter or all of those things. That's all linked down in the description box below. If you'd like to support the channel further, I have a Patreon link in the description box below where you can get all sorts of extra benefits. And I also have an Etsy store with my art prints, including the lovely Tifa here, who is almost certainly from a JRPG that everybody loves. And all of these are hand-drawn, no AI, no none of that. So if you'd like to support the channel, then perhaps you'd like to consider looking at the link to the store in the description box below. But thank you very much for joining me once again. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel if you have enjoyed this video and you would like to see more from what I have to offer. And I'll see you next time. Take care, everyone, and have a lovely day. Bye bye.